Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm so excited to be back with the second half of the NC Miata engine swap series. After a little break because of some other commitments, I'm really excited to have the second half of the series coming to you. In this video, we're going to be putting the engine onto the subframe of the car, connecting the transmission to the engine, and then putting all that into the chassis of the car. So this is a really big first step in the process. So I had prepped the motor on an engine stand and then moved it to the engine hoist to put it onto the subframe. And one tip that I have for doing this process is to really be careful with the valve cover. Since the valve cover is plastic, you don't want that chain that holds the motor to damage it with the weight of the engine. So that's something that we're really cognizant of when we were setting this whole process up. And our next challenges were simply getting the engine hoist to fit so that we could line up the engine. Since the engine hoist that we had bought for the second half of this project was a little smaller than the one we had originally used, we had a hard time putting the jack stands that were holding the subframe in between the legs. So once we got that sorted, our next step was to just make sure that the engine is aligned with the motor mounts. We had to go really slowly with this process because we didn't want to drop the motor and damage anything, and we just had to make sure that those motor mounts were aligned. It took a lot of patience and just trial and error, going up and down, figuring everything out. But once we were finally able to do that, it was just simply putting those two bolts in. Of course, I'm covering that one, but you'll see on the other side. Just putting those two bolts in and tightening them so that the engine is secure. And next was a little bit of preventative maintenance. Since we had the transmission off the engine already, we saw it as a good time to replace the rear main seal. Since it had been sitting out in a warehouse before we got the motor, we thought that it might be damaged anyway. And we just saw it as a really good opportunity to do it so that we wouldn't have to do it in the future. And just a little preview, this ended up not going as planned, so we will have a future video discussing this in a lot greater depth. But while we were at it, we also changed the pilot bearing. With the extractor tool, we took it out and put a new one in. Again, it just seemed like the right time. If the engine has 40,000 miles on it, it wasn't something that was particularly necessary, but now we have the peace of mind knowing that we have not only new but upgraded parts to go into the car so that we can go another long time without doing this work. And it just makes sense now that the engine's out like this. It's a lot easier access than working through the transmission tunnel of the car. And I know from experience because in a later video we'll be having to do part of this process over again. So that'll be towards the end of the series, unfortunately. So after putting it in initially, we used a rubber mallet hammer to hit the pilot bearing in. And then we cleaned up the area with air to make sure that there wasn't any debris or residue, because when you put the rear main seal on, the bottom gets a little bit of silicone sealant and that needs to have a clean surface to seal and stick onto. So that's my dad doing this process right here. And unfortunately we didn't actually get a video of us installing the rear main seal, but like I said, in a future video we're going to go in depth into just rear main seal replacement because that ended up being a really big challenge on this car. We had never really seen a rear main seal like this. It's a Ford part and it requires a special tool, and we weren't aware of that when we started this project. So keep a lookout for that video. It will hopefully be really helpful for anybody who's undertaking this project, and hopefully they won't run into the same problems that we did. So here we are putting the flywheel onto the engine now. After my dad put all the bolts on, he then went one by one putting Loctite on it to make sure that they stay in place and don't get loose over time. And after he did this, he used one of the smaller impact guns that we have to tighten these bolts. It's good because it didn't damage anything, but it was enough to tighten it in place before we went through it with a torque wrench and made it to spec. And those specs from the torque wrench that we got were from the Mazda maintenance manual that he got me for Christmas. It's an official thing that Mazda mechanics would have. I would really recommend getting that book, and if you can't find it, you could always reach out to me on Instagram or over email, and I could definitely send you those pages that you need for your project. So here we are. I'm holding the engine in place but through that flywheel holder, because we don't want to start cranking the engine, because we could mess up the timing belt, and that's just not something that we wanted to deal with. So once we finished with that, it was a matter of greasing the pilot bearing to make sure that it would go in smoothly, and then we he cleaned the flywheel before putting the clutch disc on, and that's an upgraded XD clutch disc that I'm really excited about and super happy with the performance so far. And then he put the upgraded XD pressure plate on before also Loctiting each bolt and then tightening those bolts as well. And for the clutch, you want to go in a star pattern similar to a wheel, because since the clutch has pressure, you don't want to tighten one side and then tighten the other, because it'll create unevenness and you'll have challenges both installing, and you don't want to damage anything as well. So while he's doing that, I was holding the flywheel again so that the engine doesn't turn, and then here he is tightening those bolts. You can see how he's going in that star pattern. And so fast forwarding a little, here we are torquing it. Again, I'm holding the flywheel while my dad goes about torquing it. And what we do is we torque it to the lower spec first to make sure that everything's in place, and then we'll raise the torque to the final spec, and then that's like the tightening spec that you use. And here we are getting the transmission ready to get bolted up to the engine. I kind of cut this a little because it took a while, but it's just a matter of making sure that you're in on the pilot bearing and then just jiggling into place, as you can see here, making sure that it goes in. It took a while, but once we got it in, we put the bolts into the back, and something that I would recommend doing is if you could thread the bolt, maybe putting one in the bottom and one in the top. That way you have kind of a guide, and then from there you could just start jiggling it as it goes into place. So yeah, that was everything to get the engine and transmission into the subframe to get ready to put it back in the chassis. And here's the final product. We had 4 jacks holding the subframe, and then 1 jack holding the transmission from the rear, because the transmission doesn't have any bracing back there. And you can see that the engine bay is prepped as well. We had left the shock absorbers in the car, so one of the challenges that we had was to make sure it would go through the top A-arm and wouldn't get a hit or obstruct anything. Another challenge was making sure that the steering column didn't get in the way of anything. Since the steering column stayed in the car, it would interfere with the engine intake and just some of the wiring, and so we had to bend it out of the way but make sure not to break it or damage it. That was a challenge, but just by slowly moving the car down and maneuvering the steering column, we patiently put it in place and put it in position with everything kind of out of the way, which just made more sense. We also had to be really careful of wiring and hoses, because we didn't want them to be pinched or crushed in between the chassis and the subframe, because some of the wiring and the hoses for coolant specifically kind of run in between the chassis and the subframe, or very close to that gap. And so we didn't want to just like slam the car down and damage something, because that would be a really big job to redo the wiring harness or to put some new hoses on the car, especially when the engine's already in. The good thing is that there's one of the guides for the subframe is a lot longer than the others, so we were using that guide as a kind of a point of reference to understand if we were on track to put the engine in the right way, or if we were a little off center in any way. So you can see here that we're kind of like scooting the subframe forward and backward just to make sure we're in place. And here I am moving the steering shaft. So once we dropped it all in, we went underneath the car and bolted it up. Here you can see I'm bolting it up. I kind of fast forwarded a little because there's a lot up and down. And then once that was done, we were able to freely lift the car and then get on to putting the transmission back in place, the drive shaft, the exhaust, as well as the brace that connects the differential and the transmission as well. So that's kind of the end of this first video. I'm really happy to be back creating these YouTube videos. I took a little bit of a break because of the Formula Drift season, as well as work and just life, but I'm so happy to share with you all the second half of this process. The car has been so fun to drive, and as we begin to fine tune it, I'll be sharing that process as well. So stay tuned for next Tuesday's video where we continue this process, and thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it.